There are names that do not leave when the person does, echoes that linger long after the door has closed, and memories that sit beside you like an uninvited guest you cannot dismiss. You tell yourself to move on, to be strong, to forget, but the heart does not obey commands as easily as the mind pretends. And so you carry them in quiet moments, in restless nights, in the spaces where your strength feels thin. But hear this truth rising gently and firmly within you. Letting go is not an act of erasing them. It is the sacred decision to stop abandoning yourself in the process of remembering them. And there are rules, soft, steady, unshakable rules, that will guide you out of this longing and back into the fullness of your own life. There is a kind of pain that does not announce itself loudly. It does not always come with tears or visible collapse. Sometimes it sits quietly in your chest, disguised as thoughtfulness, disguised as memory, disguised as something you call just missing them. But beneath that disguise, it is still ache, real, unprocessed, and waiting to be acknowledged. And the truth is, you cannot release what you refuse to admit is still holding on to you. What remains unnamed will always remain in control of your inner world. We are often taught to be strong by pretending we are untouched, as if silence is the same as healing. So you tell yourself it does not hurt as much anymore, or that you are fine, or that it was not that serious. But your mind knows better. It returns to the same faces, the same words, the same unfinished conversations when the world grows quiet. That repetition is not weakness. It is evidence. Evidence that something within you is still asking to be seen, not judged, not rushed away, but simply acknowledged with honesty. To acknowledge the ache is not to surrender to it. It is to stop fighting reality long enough to understand it. There is a deep relief in saying, yes, this still affects me, because in that moment, you stop splitting yourself in two, one part pretending to be over it, and the other silently carrying the weight. Wholeness begins when you allow both truth and tenderness to exist in the same breath. But shame often tries to enter at this stage. It whispers that you should be further along, that you should have moved on by now, that thinking about them means you are weak or stuck. Yet shame does not heal anything. It only buries it deeper. And what is buried does not disappear. It grows roots in silence and shows up later in unexpected ways. Real strength is not found in denial, but in the courage to look inward without flinching. When you finally stop arguing with your own feelings, something shifts. The ache begins to lose its sharpness, not because it is ignored, but because it is understood. You begin to see that what you were calling attachment was also grief, and what you were calling missing them was also the mind trying to make sense of absence. And understanding softens what resistance only deepens. There comes a point where you realize you do not need to punish yourself for still feeling. Feelings are not failures. They are messages, and when you listen without shame, you begin to respond instead of react. You stop chasing distractions to outrun your own heart, and instead you sit with it long enough to hear what it has been trying to say all along. And slowly, something quiet and powerful begins to happen. The ache that once felt like it defined you starts to loosen its grip, not because you forced it away, but because you finally faced it. And in that honest meeting with yourself, you discover that acknowledging pain was never the end of your strength. It was the beginning of your freedom. There is a subtle trick the heart plays when it is not ready to let go. It does not show you the full picture at once. Instead, it selects fragments, soft moments, rare laughter, brief kindness, and it builds a story around them, a story that feels warmer than the truth that followed. In that space between memory and reality, pain begins to lose its edge and slowly turns into something almost gentle, almost meaningful. But what you are often holding on to is not the full experience. It is a carefully lit version of it, shaped by longing rather than honesty. When you begin to miss someone, The mind rarely revisits the moments that broke you. It does not replay the silence after the argument, or the confusion that followed inconsistency, or the heaviness you carried when words no longer matched actions. Instead, it brings forward the early warmth, the possibility, the version of them that existed before reality settled in. And without noticing, you start to believe that was the whole story. That is how pain becomes disguised as nostalgia. But truth does not disappear just because it is inconvenient. It waits beneath the surface of softened memory, unchanged by how gently you now speak of it. If you look closely, beyond the emotional glow your mind creates, you will find the parts that were not kind to you. The moments where you felt unsure of your place, where you had to shrink your needs, where clarity was replaced with confusion. Those moments matter just as much as the ones you replay. Romanticizing what hurt you is not love. It is avoidance dressed as devotion. It is the mind trying to protect you from grief by turning complexity into simplicity. Because it is easier to miss a fantasy than to accept a disappointment. But healing asks for something braver than comfort. It asks for accuracy, not exaggeration of pain, not erasure of joy, but honest recognition of both. When you begin to see clearly, something shifts inside you. The emotional fog starts to lift, not because the past changes, but because your perception does. You stop feeding energy into an illusion that no longer reflects your reality. And in that clarity, you may feel a strange emptiness at first, as if something familiar has been taken away. But what is actually happening is release. The space that was once occupied by distortion is slowly becoming available for truth. And truth, even when it is difficult, is what brings you back to yourself. It grounds you in what actually happened, not what you wished had happened. It allows you to understand that missing someone is not always a sign of deep connection. It can also be a sign that your mind has not yet stopped rewriting the past. With time, when you stop dressing pain in softness it did not earn, you begin to see it for what it was. Not to punish yourself, not to erase what you felt, but to finally stop returning to a story that keeps you from moving forward. And in that quiet acceptance, you discover something powerful. Letting go becomes possible the moment you stop confusing memory with truth. There is a moment in every letting go where illusion begins to lose its voice. It does not leave all at once. It fades slowly, like a dream dissolving at sunrise, where what once felt certain now becomes harder to hold with conviction. You start to see that much of your attachment was not anchored in what was consistently real, but in what felt possible. And possibility, though beautiful, can sometimes keep you standing in a place that reality has already asked you to leave. Illusion is not always a lie someone tells you directly. Often, it is something you build in the quiet spaces between their actions. You connect scattered moments of kindness and call it character. You take brief clarity and stretch it into permanence. You remember potential more vividly than pattern. And without realizing it, you begin to relate not to the person in front of you, but to a version of them that exists more in hope than in truth. Reality, however, is less gentle at first glance. It does not soften itself to match your emotional investment. It simply remains consistent in what it shows you, how someone treats you when things are easy, and how they treat you when things are difficult, how they show up when it is convenient, and how they disappear when it requires effort. These patterns are not accidental, they are information. And yet, information is often the first thing the heart tries to reinterpret when it does not want to accept loss. Choosing reality over illusion is not a sudden act of emotional detachment. It is a gradual return to honesty with yourself. It is the quiet decision to stop editing their behavior into something more comforting than it was. It is the courage to say, "This is what actually happened," even when another part of you wants to argue for what almost happened, what briefly appeared, what might have been different under better circumstances. There is grief in this process because illusions are not empty, they are emotionally filled. They carry your effort, your patience, your understanding, your waiting. Letting them go can feel like letting go of time you cannot get back, but what you are truly releasing is not time wasted. It is attachment to a story that no longer aligns with your lived experience. And slowly, as you begin to separate who they could have been from who they consistently were, something stabilizes within you. The emotional turbulence softens. You stop negotiating with contradiction. You stop trying to reconcile behavior that never truly aligned. And in that clarity, even if it feels unfamiliar at first, there is a quiet strength that begins to form. Because reality, though less romantic than illusion, is far more freeing. It does not require you to maintain hope against evidence. It does not ask you to keep interpreting inconsistency as depth. It simply allows you to see, and in seeing, to finally loosen your grip. And when your hands are no longer full of what was never fully there, you begin to notice what has been waiting for your attention all along, yourself returning steadily to you. There is a quiet exhaustion that comes not from what you have done with your hands, but from what you have continued to do with your mind. You may not notice it at first, because thinking feels harmless, even invisible. But every thought carries weight. Every return to a memory, every imagined conversation, every silent questioning of what went wrong or what could have been, it all draws from the same inner well of energy that is meant to sustain you in your present life. When your attention is anchored in someone who is no longer actively building with you, your energy begins to scatter. A part of you remains in the past, revisiting moments that cannot be changed. Another part tries to predict outcomes that will never arrive, and the part of you that is meant to live, to grow, to experience what is actually in front of you, is left waiting for your full return. That division creates a subtle but constant fatigue, as if life itself feels heavier than it should. To reclaim your energy is not about forcing your mind into silence. It is about noticing where it keeps traveling without your permission. It is the gentle awareness that every time you replay a story that no longer serves your becoming, you are not just remembering, you are investing. And what you invest in mentally begins to shape your emotional world. If your thoughts repeatedly circle what hurt you, your inner world begins to orbit that pain, even in moments of stillness. There is a turning point, though it rarely arrives loudly. It comes when you begin to realize that your focus has value, that your attention is not meant to be endlessly scattered toward places that do not give anything back. And in that realization, something soft but firm begins to rise within you, a willingness to withdraw from inner patterns that drain rather than nourish you. Bringing your focus back home is not a rejection of what you felt. It is a recognition that your life cannot continue to be lived in emotional fragments. It is the decision to sit with yourself again, without constantly checking on what is no longer yours to understand or fix. At first, this can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because the mind resists change, especially when it has been trained to orbit a single emotional center for too long. But slowly, as you interrupt the habit of returning, you begin to notice space where overthinking used to live, space where emotional tension used to tighten. And in that space, something quieter begins to emerge, your own presence, unburdened by constant mental negotiation with the past. You start to feel moments without immediately attaching them to old memories. You begin to experience your day without dividing it between what is happening and what you wish had happened differently. And in doing so, you reclaim something far more important than the person you were thinking about. You reclaim the part of you that was always meant to be here, fully, without interruption. And over time, the energy you once scattered begins to gather again, not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped sending it everywhere else. Forgiveness is often mistaken for a return ticket, as if the moment you forgive someone, you are also agreeing to let them back into the sacred spaces of your life. But true forgiveness does not open doors that were closed for your protection. It does something quieter, something deeper. It frees your hands from what you have been gripping for too long, even when those hands are trembling from exhaustion. There comes a point where holding on to hurt begins to feel like carrying a weight that no longer belongs to your future. You replay what happened, not because it changes anything, but because the mind searches for meaning in what hurt it. You ask silent questions that have no new answers. You imagine different endings to a story that has already reached its final page. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to live in a loop where the past keeps asking for your attention, even though it has nothing more to offer your becoming. Forgiveness, in its truest form, is not an agreement with what was done. It is not approval, and it is not forgetfulness. It is release. It is the moment you decide that what they did will no longer have authority over how you move forward. It is the quiet declaration that your peace will not remain hostage to their behavior. And that declaration is not spoken to them. It is spoken within you, where the real weight has always been carried. But letting go does not always feel immediate. Sometimes, even after you decide to forgive, your emotions take longer to catch up. There may still be echoes of anger, fragments of sadness, moments where memory returns uninvited. This does not mean forgiveness has failed. It means you are human, and healing is not a switch. It is a process of gradual unlearning. What matters is that you do not confuse forgiveness with access. A person can be released from your resentment and still not be restored to your life. Because peace is not built on repetition of what broke you. It is built on the wisdom of recognizing that some doors were closed not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. And self-respect does not require reopening what has already proven unstable for your spirit. There is a deep strength in forgiving someone without returning to them. It is the strength of choosing calm over chaos, clarity over confusion, and dignity over emotional repetition. It is the understanding that you can wish no harm upon someone and still choose distance from them. You can let go of anger and still honor the lesson that came with it. And as you practice this kind of forgiveness, something within you begins to settle. The need for resolution from the outside slowly fades. You stop waiting for apologies that may never come, and you stop measuring your healing by someone else's acknowledgement. Instead, you begin to measure it by how light your own chest feels when their memory no longer dictates your emotional state. In that quiet shift, you realize something powerful. Peace was never dependent on their return, their regret, or their understanding. It was always waiting for your release. And once you give it that, you do not lose anything that was meant for you. You simply stop carrying what was never meant to stay. There are thoughts that arrive like visitors, and then there are thoughts that behave like residents, uninvited, familiar, settling into the corners of your mind as if they belong there. When someone has taken deep emotional space within you, your mind can begin to return to them automatically, almost habitually, even when your heart has already begun to understand the need for distance. It is not always love that keeps them alive in your thinking. More often, it is repetition, a mental pathway worn so often that it begins to feel like destiny, when, in truth, it is only pattern. You may find yourself thinking of them without intention. A place reminds you, a silence reminds you, a passing moment of stillness becomes a doorway back to memories you did not consciously choose to enter. And in those moments, it can feel as if you are still connected, still bound, still somehow unfinished. But what is actually happening is far simpler and far more changeable. Your mind is following a familiar route it has taken many times before. Habits of thought are not different from habits of action. Just as the body learns to reach for a phone without thinking or walk a familiar path without awareness, the mind learns to reach for certain memories in emotional reflex. And anything learned can also be unlearned, But unlearning requires patience with yourself because the mind does not surrender old pathways instantly. It resists change, not because it is right, but because it is used to repetition. Breaking the habit of revisiting someone begins with noticing, not punishing. The moment you catch yourself drifting back to them, you are no longer fully inside the pattern, you are observing it, and that observation is where change begins. You do not need to force the thought away with anger or guilt. In fact, resistance often strengthens what it tries to remove. Instead, there is power in simply recognizing, this is where my mind has gone again. Over time, that recognition becomes a pause, and within that pause, space begins to open. Space where you can gently redirect yourself, not through force, but through choice. You begin to place your attention elsewhere, even if only for a few seconds at first, into what is in front of you, into what is real, into what is still alive and unfolding in your present moment. It is important to understand that thinking of someone does not always mean you still belong to them emotionally. Sometimes it only means your mind has not yet learned a new rhythm. And rhythms can be changed, not suddenly, not perfectly, but gradually through consistent return to yourself. Each time you bring your attention back, you are not failing, you are retraining, and slowly something shifts. The thoughts still come, but they no longer stay as long. They lose their intensity. They begin to feel less like truth and more like echoes. And one day, without dramatic realization, you notice that the habit has loosened its grip, not because you forced it into silence, but because you stopped feeding it your constant return. In that quiet space, you begin to understand something deeply liberating. You were never meant to live inside repetitive memory. You were meant to live in the unfolding present, where your attention is no longer tied to what repeats in your mind, but to what is finally becoming available to your life again. There is a moment in healing that often goes unnoticed, yet it carries more power than any dramatic emotional breakthrough. It is the moment you realize that what you have been calling missing them is sometimes not love at all, but repetition. A mental path walked so many times that it begins to feel inevitable, as if your thoughts have no choice but to return there. But thoughts are not destiny. They are patterns, and patterns, no matter how familiar, can be changed. At first, it does not feel like a habit. It feels personal. It feels meaningful. It feels as though your mind is simply responding to something deep and unresolved in your heart. But if you watch closely, without judgment, you begin to see the timing of it, how it comes in waves, how it arrives during silence, during boredom, during moments when your attention is not anchored in the present. It is not always the person you are longing for. It is the space your mind fills when it is not guided elsewhere. And so you begin to understand something quietly transformative. The mind is not always speaking truth when it repeats a name. Sometimes it is simply repeating what it has learned to repeat. Just like a road that gets walked every day becomes the easiest route, even if it no longer leads anywhere meaningful. Familiarity can disguise itself as necessity, when in truth it is only repetition without renewal. Breaking this cycle does not require force. In fact, force often strengthens what it tries to erase. The more you fight a thought, the more attention you give it. And attention is the very fuel that keeps it alive. What begins to weaken its hold is not resistance, but awareness. The simple, steady recognition that says, I have been here before, I know this pattern. In that recognition, something subtle shifts. You are no longer inside the thought, you are observing it, and observation creates space. A space where you are no longer completely absorbed, no longer fully identified with what your mind is doing. And in that space, even if it is small at first, you gain a choice you did not notice you had before. You may still think of them. That is not failure. The difference is what happens next. Do you follow the thought, or do you return to yourself? At first, returning will feel like effort. You will have to gently redirect your attention again and again, sometimes many times in a single day. But repetition also works in your favor here, because just as the mind learned to return to them, it can learn to return to you. And slowly, without dramatic declaration, the pattern begins to loosen. The thoughts lose urgency, they lose their emotional charge. They begin to feel less like a place you are pulled into and more like a place you occasionally pass by. You no longer live there, you simply remember that you used to. What once felt like emotional gravity starts to weaken, not because you forced yourself away from it, but because you stopped feeding it your unconscious return. And in that quiet shift, something deeply freeing emerges. The realization that your mind is not a prison of the past. It is a space you can gently retrain until what once controlled your attention becomes just another passing thought, no longer guiding your direction, no longer defining your peace. There is a quiet kind of pain that does not always announce itself with tears or visible breaking. It often arrives in thought, in the subtle questioning of self-worth that begins after someone has left. You start to wonder, sometimes without even realizing it, if their absence says something about your value. If their silence means you were not enough, if their departure is proof of something lacking within you. But this is where perception begins to bend away from truth. The leaving of another person, no matter how deeply it is felt, is not a measurement of your worth. It is a reflection of choice, timing, capacity, and circumstances that often have far more to do with them than with the essence of who you are. Yet the human heart, in its vulnerability, tends to internalize absence. It turns separation into self-questioning. It takes what was a decision outside of you and begins to translate it into judgment about you. But worth is not something that arrives and departs with people. It is not assigned through approval, nor withdrawn through distance. It is something that exists beneath experience, untouched by who stays and who leaves. The difficulty lies not in the loss itself, but in the meaning we attach to it. Because when someone walks away, the mind often searches for reasons, and in that search, it can turn inward in ways that are not always fair. You may begin to replay moments, conversations, choices, wondering where you could have been different, where you could have been more. And in that reflection, it becomes easy to confuse growth with self-blame. But there is a difference between learning from experience and diminishing yourself because of it. One leads you forward, the other keeps you quietly tied to a version of yourself that feels incomplete. Their absence, no matter how painful, does not erase what you are. It does not subtract from your capacity to love, to understand, to grow, to become. It simply marks the end of a chapter that could not continue in the same form. And endings, though they often feel like loss, are not statements about your value. They are transitions in connection, not definitions of identity. There is a deep liberation in beginning to separate your identity from someone else's decision. In realizing that you do not need to rebuild your worth every time someone fails to see it, or cannot hold it, or chooses to walk away from it. Because if your value must constantly be proven through another person's presence, then it was never truly placed within you to begin with. But the truth is, it is already there, unmoved by departure, unchanged by silence, unreduced by absence. What shifts is not your worth, but your awareness of it. And sometimes, loss simply brings you to the edge of that awareness, where you are asked to see yourself without the reflection of someone else standing in front of you. And in that quiet space, where their absence no longer defines you, something steadier begins to form. Not the version of you that was chosen or left, but the version that remains, whole in its existence, untouched in its essence, and no longer waiting for someone else to confirm what was never truly lost. There comes a point in emotional healing where remembering is no longer the problem. The meaning you attach to what you remember is. The past does not continue to hurt you simply because it exists in your memory. It hurts because the mind keeps returning to it, interpreting it, questioning it, trying to rewrite it as if understanding it differently could somehow change what already happened. But the past does not respond to revision, it only responds to acceptance. And acceptance is not agreement. It is not saying that what happened was right or fair or deserved. It is simply the moment you stop trying to make it something other than what it was. Because as long as you are still negotiating with the past, you are still living partially inside it. You are still circling it, still measuring your present through its influence, still allowing it to shape how you see yourself today. To create new meaning is to gently withdraw from that circle. It is the decision to stop asking the same emotional questions of a story that has already ended. Not because the story did not matter, but because its meaning does not need to remain fixed in pain. What once broke, you can also become something that builds you, but only when you stop returning to it as a wound and begin viewing it as a lesson that has already spoken. This shift does not erase memory, it transforms your relationship with it. The same event that once made you feel small can, over time, become evidence of your endurance. The same experience that once left confusion can become clarity about what you will no longer accept. But none of this happens while you are still emotionally circling the past, asking it to explain itself differently than it already has. Building the present requires attention that is no longer divided. It asks you to bring your awareness back to what is unfolding now, even if it feels unfamiliar after so much time spent looking backward. At first, the present can feel quiet in comparison to the emotional intensity of memory. But that quiet is not emptiness. It is space, space that was previously occupied by repetition, by reflection, by emotional revisiting. In that space, something new begins to form. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually through attention. You begin to notice things you were too distracted to see before. You begin to feel moments without filtering them through the past. You begin to respond to life as it is, not as it echoes. And slowly, without forcing it, meaning starts to shift. What once defined your pain no longer defines your identity. What once felt like a closed chapter becomes part of a larger story that continues beyond it. You stop asking the past to give you closure, because you realize closure is not something the past hands to you. It is something you build in how you choose to live now. There is a quiet strength in no longer circling what cannot be changed, in choosing instead to place your energy where it can actually shape something, your thoughts, your direction, your growth. And in that choice, you begin to understand that moving forward is not about forgetting what happened, but about refusing to let it be the only place your mind knows how to return to. And when that shift finally settles within you, the past does not disappear, but it stops leading. And for the first time, your life is no longer an echo of what was, but a space where something new is finally allowed to begin.